When discussing ships, people tend to discuss their particulars, what they did in their careers, or some characteristic that made them particularly unique. In some cases, uniqueness might come from a negative viewpoint, and in this case, the weakness of the construction of the Königsberg-class of cruisers built for the German Navy in the interwar period. They had some serious problems that affected them throughout their careers. But how weak was their construction? And did it really affect them that much throughout their careers? In today's video, we'll cover that question. Going back to just after World War I, and not quite before the High Seas Fleet scuttled itself, on April 16, 1919, the German Admiralty was instructed to create the Provisional Reichsmarine, and only several months later, the scuttling of the High Seas Fleet took place. Subsequently, any new German warship had to replace a ship condemned to scrap from a list of the most modern remaining after the scuttling. The German Navy was cut down drastically in fulfilling the Peace Treaty of Versailles. The Navy was restricted to a standing force of 15,000 men who crewed obsolete pre-dreadnoughts, and critical to our story, the Reichsmarine was allowed to have 6 light cruisers. These light cruisers were not allowed to displace more than 6,000 tons, and the armament was not to exceed 15 centimeters or 5.9 inches. When the existing cruisers of the Gazelle class had been in service for 20 years, they could be replaced by a new vessel. Of the new vessels built, Königsberg, Köln, and Karlsruhe of the K-class or Königsberg-class were introduced in the late 1920s. Königsberg, the lead ship, entered service in 1929, representing something completely new to the German Navy. Although limited by the Treaty of Versailles, the class was armed with 9 5.9-inch guns and triple turrets and 4 triple torpedo launchers. The development of light cruisers for the Reichsmarine was pretty much immediate following their creation with the development of the Emden, based on the plans for the Karlsruhe of the former Köln class from the old Imperial Navy, with provisions to allow for lessons and experiences drawn from the First World War. The Emden came under strict supervision from the Allied Control Commission, who refused to approve the initial 2 designs, resulting in 8 5.9-inch guns being placed in single gun houses. All of this to say that Emden followed mostly along the lines of the old Imperial cruisers, while the Königsberg class, who were designed under Chief Naval Architect Egrenberg in 1924/1925, were a fresh development for the German Navy. Following the proven system of longitudinal bulkheads, correspondingly, the ships were comprehensively subdivided into 16 watertight compartments, the hull being protected by light waterline armor. The armor of the cruisers was relatively standard for the time as regards light cruisers, being similar to the material used before the Great War for protected small cruisers. Still, it was improved through war experiences and new alloys, although some cuts in the armor had to be made to keep within limitations. Where things start to differ is in the arrangement of the weaponry and machinery. Starting with the weaponry, the ships carried 9 15cm, 5.9-inch guns and triple turrets, with the rear turrets offset, B to port and C to starboard, 4 triple torpedo tubes, along with various anti-aircraft guns. B and C turrets were arranged to enable them to traverse to fire much smoother over the ship in a pursuit. It can be seen as a good idea in theory, but in practice, the muzzle blast would damage the ship. These arrangements had never before been seen on any German vessel. While the machinery consisted of 6 oil-fired Schultz-Thornycroft double-ended water tube boilers and 4 boiler rooms, which provided steam for 2 turbines that drove 2 shafts. In addition, the vessels were equipped with a cruising diesel engine with turbines for the diesel. Using their full power, the ships could achieve 32 knots. The machinery again differed from previous German designs, namely Emden. Their engine rooms were uncomplicated and generally reliable. However, because of the limitations, the machinery took up half the 16 compartments, spreading it over a greater area than normal. Another change in these ships was the beam-to-length ratio, in layman's terms, the measurement of how slim a ship is, which in the Königsberg class was 11:1, having a long flat aftership with an inclined stern. This is an important aspect of the ship, which we will discuss in a minute. All of this fire-powered machinery had to fit onto a vessel that weighed ostensibly 6,000 tons. Because of that, weight-saving measures had to be undertaken. Namely, 85% of the hulls were welded, and light metals were used wherever possible. These efforts to save weight and keep the ships within treaty limitations resulted in the sides, decks, bulkheads, and frames of the three ships being rather thin. Fractures and tears occurred amidships when going through rough seas or when the guns were fired. These problems were not solved by the time the final two German light cruisers entered service, although it should be noted the cruisers represented a completely new type, something Germany had never built. I feel that it's worth quoting German light cruisers of World War II, Warships of the Kriegsmarine by Gerhard Koop and Klaus-Peter Schmolke. The five latter German light cruisers were children of their time, the result of what designers had found possible to engineer within the limitations of the Washington Agreement, and a vast improvement on Emden except as regards seaworthiness. The great weakness of the K cruisers, Königsberg, Köln, and Karlsruhe, was their light construction. The fault lay not with the designers, but in the restrictions of the Versailles Treaty. They go on to discuss how when it comes to the different military requirements of hitting power and ability to take punishment, great range, and long endurance at sea, they could not meet all of those requirements. Compromises needed to be made somewhere. Thus, the ships lacked robustness, coming to a head in rough seas when the weakness of their construction was shown. Several times, Köln's superstructure had to be reinforced, where welded seams failed at joints, especially on and around the funnels and the upper deck. These problems were universal in the Königsberg-class. This lack of robustness, due in part to the weakness of the welding and the large length-to-beam ratio, meant the ships had speed restrictions in bad weather. If the weather was severe, they had to seek shelter as they ran the risk of capsizing. Due to the ships being in weather where this could have been a real possibility, they were confined to the North Sea and Baltic. Eventually, they were allowed to stray beyond home waters, with the ships heading to Spain, but were restricted to fine weather periods. If that was not bad enough, because of the stability issues, their fuel reserves were crucial to keeping them balanced, so much so that the forward and aft fuel bunkers had to be emptied first and that they could not fall below a certain point. It also meant frequent refueling, meaning that in wartime, they could not operate beyond coastal waters, making them useless as commerce raiders. When designing ships, naval architects set aside a certain amount of weight as an allowance known as the Admiralty Reserve, to save weight for additions and changes. With the K-class cruisers, though, the architects pretty much had to build up to the 6,000-ton displacement limit, making it difficult to leave room for new weapons, new fire control systems, and aircraft catapults. When these were added, it increased the top weight of the ships and contributed heavily to their stability issues, and this is why they were forced to remove their aircraft catapults. As for the particulars of the Königsberg, since she and her sisters were so similar, she was laid down on April 12, 1926, launched on February 26, 1927, and commissioned on April 17, 1929. Having a design displacement of 6,000 tons, she came out around 300 tons over the limit, wherein she operated at closer to 7,700 tons. Her machinery consisted of 6 oil-fired double-ended water tube boilers, giving steam to 2 geared turbines, powering 2 screws, giving her a maximum output of around 68,200 shaft horsepower and a top speed of 32.1 knots, while her cruising diesel powered the cruising geared turbines, giving her a 10-knot cruising speed. As for her weaponry, she carried 9 15cm, 5.9-inch guns and 3 triple turrets, 1 forward and 2 aft, with B and C turrets aft. Just as a quick aside, German turrets are as follows: Anton, Bruno, Caesar, and Dora, just so we're clear. As for anti-aircraft guns, she was initially equipped with multiple 88mm guns, being further augmented by more 88mm guns, along with 37mm and 20mm guns in various mountings, not to mention the 4 triple torpedo tubes. As regards armor, she had an armored deck varying between 20 and 40mm, or 0.8 inches and 1.6 inches, a main belt of between 50 and 70mm, or 1.6 inches and 2.8 inches, while the citadel area had a thickness of 70mm, or 2.8 inches. Each turret face had between 20 and 30mm, or 0.8 inches and 1.2 inches, with barbettes varying between 30mm, or 1.2 inches, and the command tower varied between 30mm and 100mm, or 1.2 inches and 3.9 inches. It should be noted that Karlsruhe was the only one that was given a major refit due to the war, and saw some changes that made her better suited for operations than the other ships. It's interesting because the ships did travel to different ports and visit places around the world, even with the weakness of their construction. However, things did change in 1936 when Karlsruhe was caught in a storm in the Pacific, causing significant damage and eventually a refit. She found herself in the Pacific in March 1936, and as you see, the cruiser planned to sail from Batavia in the Dutch East Indies onto Hong Kong and several ports in Japan. However, on March 12th, the weather took a turn for the worse. We'll get back to that in a minute, but overall for these ships, they had somewhat similar careers, with the most notable event during the interwar period being the Karlsruhe almost being sunk while crossing the Pacific in March 1936, as she was rolling and yawing fiercely, pounding and groaning at the steams, seeming like she was going to burst apart. Eventually, one of the longitudinal frames buckled. Others followed on March 19th. On the boat deck, a fissure stretched from one side of the hull to the other. Testing the ship's strength and their faith, the crew went west, heading for safety in the Aleutian Islands. The storm finally subsided on the 21st, and on the 23rd, they made it to Dutch Harbor, spending the next 5 days patching up with shipboard tools, and then heading on to San Diego, where with the help of the U.S. Naval base, they patched up the ship as best they could, creating quite the patch job with I-beams. Arriving back in Germany on June 19, 1936. As for their wartime service, both Königsberg and Karlsruhe were sunk whilst participating in Operation Weserübung, Königsberg by bombs and Karlsruhe by a torpedo from a submarine. Köln, on the other hand, had survived until the end of the war, being sunk in Wilhelmshaven and scrapped following the war. Since she was sunk on an even keel, with a little bit of effort, both B and C turrets were able to fire on advancing Allied troops, something I cover in my second video on the death of the Kriegsmarine series. The near disaster to Karlsruhe led to her career terminating as a cadet training ship, and instead, she went to the docks for repairs and a scheduled refit. Changes to the ship included the erection of a deckhouse between the forefunnel and battle mast, between the catapult and the forefunnel, the enlargement of the deckhouse aft, and 88mm gun mounts. Running trials in September, after this work was complete, surprisingly she was able to be repaired following such extensive damage. Like almost every other German cruiser we have discussed, she'd participated in Spanish neutrality patrols, doing this on and off between 1936 and 1938, wherein in May 1938 she was decommissioned for a large refit. This was because of the poor experiences of the 3 Königsberg-class cruisers, particularly issues with their weak construction, poor stability, and near-fatal Pacific cruise for Karlsruhe. Koop and Schmolke write about the major alterations. The foretop was reduced from double to single story. The staff on the foretop was replaced by a mast, and the searchlight platform on the battle mast was raised. The after funnel was shortened, and slightly canted caps were fitted to both funnels. The derrick post with searchlight stations was unshipped, and searchlight platforms were erected abreast the funnels. A large bent arm crane was installed on the starboard side and a straight arm crane on the port side. A taller mainmast with long tripod legs was fitted. Twin 10.5cm weapons replaced the 8.8cm twin flaks, and a 10.5cm single was fitted on the aft superstructure deck. Anti-mine gear was also added, and they report that some sources claim the cruising diesel was removed, although unlikely as the post-refit blueprints show it in place. This was the only major refit that any of the vessels received due to the war, but were they really that bad of ships? Taking from Gordon Williamson in his book German Light Cruisers 1939 to 1945, he writes, "This class of cruisers, of which there were 3, the Königsberg, Köln, and Karlsruhe, was classified as Spähkreuzer, literally reconnaissance or scouting cruiser. They were never intended to give serious battle to equivalent enemy warships, but rather to hit and run. Thus, 6 of their 9 15cm guns were mounted into 2 triple turrets facing aft, to give better chance of fending off pursuing enemy ships. In the K-class, the 2 aft turrets were also mounted off-center, allowing the stern turrets to traverse further around in the direction of the bow and be brought into action if the cruiser was pursuing a victim. The severe treaty restrictions under whose terms the K-class cruisers were built, and many weight-saving measures employed resulted in vessels that were rather weak structurally, as would be proven by the storm damage suffered by Karlsruhe during her 1936 cruise to the Pacific. In addition, the effective range without refueling was rather modest compared with ships such as the pocket battleships and heavy cruisers that were later built. The K-class were not really suitable for long-distance operational use, indeed being inferior to the older Emden in this respect, and in the event, after the outbreak of war, they were restricted to coastal duties. The weight-saving measures were certainly an issue when it came to structural integrity, forcing the Germans to restrict the cruising ranges and times of year when they could go out. Not only that, stability was an issue like I mentioned previously. Williamson writes, "Of all the major German warship classes, the light cruisers were probably the least successful. When all that was expected of them was to carry cadets on international goodwill cruises, they experienced severe problems in their seaworthiness. They were simply too flimsy for use on the world's major oceans. As far as their combat use was concerned, their record was less than impressive. Their armor was similar to other light cruisers of the period, and therefore wasn't as big of an issue as you might think. Still, when it comes to the different military requirements of hitting power and ability to take punishment, great range, and long endurance at sea, they could not meet all of those requirements. Compromises needed to be made somewhere, and it just so happened that it was going to be their robustness. Their weakness showed in their service, and all were sunk during their careers. But were they bad ships? I tend to say they were children of their time, like Koop and Schmolke, under the circumstances and their decision to make firepower a priority, whereas the older Emden was far more seaworthy. Yet the cruisers represented a completely new type of ship for Germany. They did have good qualities, good speed, a heavy armament for their size. They just had to compromise with the robustness. Anyway, what do you think? Let me know down below. Thank you all for watching, everyone. Don't forget to like and subscribe, as it'll help the channel to grow. Until next time, my friends, have a great week.